Well, welcome to And Also. This is the podcast, I would say the premier podcast of Faith Alliance Church, where Kirk Steigler and I, John Eager, talk about the either the previous sermon or the upcoming sermon. We really just have a conversation around the scripture that we as a church are talking about. So, Kirk, it's been a while, but I'm glad to do this again.
I can't believe 4 years since the last podcast.
4 years. That's
Or
what it
maybe
feels.
a little less.
That's what it feels like 4 months, but maybe it feels like 4 years.
Oh, a month. That's what I meant.
So we are not only in a new year, we're in a new series. We're wearing new clothes. I mean,
These are very old.
everything's new. Everything's new, except for the old clothes. I was wrong about that.
For those of you listening, we're both wearing hats.
It's Funny Hat Saturday as we
That's right.
record this. Isn't everyone wearing funny hats on
That is a
Saturday, June 8th? While we wear funny hats, we are starting, or we did start this past week, the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And I thought this would be a good chance for the podcast to kind of come back into swing and talk about the Sermon on the Mount, because there's a lot to talk about, because there is almost inexhaustible amounts of ideas that Jesus gives us and ways that we are called to apply them, which those are infinite. So we have all these things to talk about. That we'll start with, what do you think the Sermon on the Mount is about? In 2 words or less. I'm just kidding, not in 2 words or less, but I don't know, how would you, so Jesus begins this sermon with these Beatitudes. What do you think he's getting at?
Wow, to summarize the whole thing.
In 2 words or less. I'm just kidding. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think he's trying to get at in the Sermon on the Mount?
I think this list is his view on how upside down the world is. Because if you look at the world through the eyes we're used to seeing it with, through our corrupted view, right? Because of sin, we think of somebody who wins as the champion and deserves everything. And here he comes along, and the people who inherit everything are the meek. The people who are not trying to win or not trying to do any of that stuff, right? So it's turning everything on its head from the viewpoint of what we're used to seeing. I mean, even in terms of the Romans at that time, right? So they conquered, but they're not going to inherit all that. They don't get to keep it, right? So everything goes away. Yeah. Everything changes from the viewpoint of his kingdom. And that's fascinating. Like, this is him telling everyone, you got it all backwards.
Yeah.
That, to me, is the summary of this and how to live going forward.
5 words. You got it all backwards. I really like that perspective, because even the way he starts, when I was listening to something else where they did say that they said the blessed are the poor in spirit. Those 3 lines, the poor in spirit, the mourn, and the meek, are almost shock value. That they're intended to do something, but they're so shocking because we would never look and say, like, if you just polled 10 people on the street, what does it mean to have a blessed life? They'd say, well, it means to, live here or do this or have this. It's all material. It's all
right.
And Jesus right off the gate is saying, no, the poor in spirit are the blessed ones, and the meek and those who mourn. And it's almost like to shock us out of our way of thinking, to think, well, what if there is a different way of life? And so it's right off the gate. Yeah, Jesus is saying, like, this is like you likely have it wrong. You've got it all backwards, and it is like a big reset button to say this is what life actually looks like.
Which that fascinates me. So he's just walking along the countryside and climbs this hill because he notices behind him is a large crowd, and he goes, hey, you know what? Hang on a minute. And addresses everybody who just was wandering along behind the crowd.
Yeah.
So, like, talk about captive audience. But then you had all this queued up. That's amazing and interesting and fascinating that he's got this view that he needs to share with everybody,
Yeah.
as many as possible here at this point in time, at this location. We're going to talk about how to reset it all.
Yeah.
Reset our thinking, reset the way we live, which it ends with you need to be more righteous than the than the Pharisees.
Yeah.
Good luck, right? So
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
amazing, right? So amazing.
Well, so I honestly the past couple of weeks preparing, I'm reading some commentaries and some books on it, just trying to just get my head around it, and it's been very spiritually challenging for me to like even personally to read through and be like, oh, I mean, and I know this sounds like kindergarten level, but like, well, Jesus really meant this stuff. He's not now. That's not to say that everything he's saying is literal, because he says, gouge out your eye. So he doesn't mean that literally. So there's some things obviously he's talking metaphorically, but he's very serious about the way that we're called to live our lives and work toward and live toward, and he's not being hyperbolic when he says love your enemy. He's not saying, well, can you imagine a scenario in which you would love your enemy? He's like, no, you actually you need to love your enemy. The only way to live right side up or to live reset is loving your enemy as a norm, which is like the hardest thing to do. Or like it's so as you go through, it's like not this massive reset, but it becomes, at least for me, it's been really spiritually challenging in I think and I hope all the right ways. Where it's like, oh, like Jesus is actually calling us to do these things. That are hard, but then he does say, like, if you look at the last chapter, the way the Sermon on the Mount ends, anyone who hears these words and puts them into practice, you have the house on the sand and the house on the rock. So according to Christ, if you hear the words and you do them, you build a foundation of life. And hear these words, previous chapters, Matthew 5-7, hear these words and put them into practice. He's like, you'll build a house and it'll be on solid foundation. So like there's a sense of like, okay, this is what life actually looks like when it's unshakable, and it's not the life of having, the best bank account or the best car, the best job, or the best, whatever success looks like. It's living the way that he's actually telling us to live.
Living humbly and kind and thoughtful and loving.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that the focus is on how we treat one another, how we care for each other, how we think about our relationship with God, how we act on that. And really, like, if you look, to me, the Sermon on the Mount is like this kind of pair of glasses that I think Christ calls us to see life through, to be like, okay, well, and that's really what I want to accomplish, at least in the series, is to be like, okay, well, if we're called to act this way in the world, then we can look at any situation we're dealing with, and the applications might be different, but we can look at any situation we're dealing with and look at them through the glasses of the Sermon on the Mount and be like, okay, that's how I need to act. We have to do some work in thinking, okay, well, what does this mean for me to live humbly, to act, to love well, to be righteous in my actions. You have to apply that, but it's still, there's not a situation I think that the Sermon on the Mount doesn't eventually cover, because it all deals with how we relate to other people.
Yeah. Which is all he was trying to get us to do. When we asked the young rich ruler, right, the same thing, right?
That's good.
Summarize it all, and here's the two things, right? That's it.
Yeah.
All of that, which always makes me reflect back, right, to Adam and Eve. Were they already living that way? And then, was life just absolutely miserable after they got kicked out of the garden because of that corruption? It must have seemed like a dramatic change if you had lived a long time.
Yeah.
Loving, kind, and humble, and meek, and then had to suddenly switch to be as awful as we are now. Holy moly, that must have been it must have felt awful.
Which is really interesting, because like, even following the, kind of the lineage, at least, or the way the stories are lined up in Genesis, if you go back to Adam and Eve, you have Cain and Abel. And I think there's some intentionality of like, here, if you want to know what life is like out of the garden, here's what it looks like.
Immediately we jump to murder.
Conquest, competition, murder, violence, murder.
Yeah.
And that's how easily there's a guy actually that I've been reading a lot of, and he says he's a believer. He's passed away now, but he's a believer, Christian. But he says that all life is basically mitigating violence. He was an anthropologist, and he studied like ancient Near Eastern tribes. And then he studied modern cultures, and he said basically all we're ever trying to do in our culture is mitigate violence, is mitigate ways in which we do not enact violence on one another. And he said the way that ancient cultures have dealt with that is through sacrifice. He said the way that we mitigate violence is one is sacrifice for the many. And he said now outside of the sacrificial system, we have he calls them scapegoats. He's using the biblical term. We have scapegoats, and he said we don't officially kill people, but he said we do as a group gang up on one or two people or one or two groups, and they become the enemy, and then we kind of like enact. We don't maybe physically create violence sometimes, but he said we kind of treat them as a scapegoat. We place all of our anger on them, and we kick them out. He was before cancel culture was a thing, but that idea of like canceling someone would be like the idea of enacting this kind of form of violence on them. So he says all of culture is mitigating violence, and he said the only way out is actually sacrifice, which is, he points to the cross, and he says Jesus is the one who took on all our evil for us, became the final sacrificial lamb, so that we no longer have to enact that. We don't have to enact that back and forth rivalry competition that leads to violence. And so it's an interesting thought. I see where he's going, and actually I don't maybe fully buy into it, but I like what he's saying. But that idea, like the only way to actually deal with our relationships in culture is eventually figuring out how to deal with violence, which is an interesting thought when you think about the Sermon on the Mount, because Jesus, he circumvents that whole thing. How do you deal with violence? You love your enemy. So meaning, or if someone slaps you on one side, you show them the other, or if someone demands 1 mile, you go with them too. And he says, so Jesus he bypasses the entire conquest, competition, rivalry, leading to violent sacrificial opportunities. He's like, you love your enemies. You go with them 2 miles. You offer them the other cheek. Like, and
you interact with them on the way to court. I like that.
Right. Yeah. Well. Right. Yeah. Like.
Just wrap it up before you get.
Yeah. It's so practical. Yeah. It's so. Yeah. It's really it's an interesting image, and I think what's to me disheartening is to read the Sermon on the Mount and then compare it with the church now. The church broadly, the American church broadly, I should say that. That's really my only experience. And see, like, well, maybe we haven't read the Sermon on the Mount enough. There's not an application of it that I'm seeing a ton.
But lots of people know how it goes, other than us.
What do you mean? Oh wait.
So the outside the church, people outside the church know that we should be following this, and that's always a kicker.
Yeah, that's a great point.
When we are not demonstrating that.
Aren't Christians supposed to be?
Right. Yeah. What happened to the meek? Right, you get that, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Right, so yeah.
It's weird.
That mirror is held up, right, on a regular basis.
I wonder, actually, that's a good way of thinking of it. The Sermon on the Mount is, to some degree, it's kind of like a mirror. Like, it's like, well, maybe we should ask ourselves, how are we doing in this?
Yeah.
Like okay, this is what the Sermon on the Mount says. This is what Jesus says. How are we doing in that?
Yeah. Because not well on a regular basis.
No, yeah. As a whole, I mean, it's a pretty easy answer. Not well. Not so great.
Not so great. On the whole.
On the whole, yeah.
Because there are people, we all know people.
Yeah.
Who do fit these roles.
Yes. And
we know that we are blessed to know them.
Yes.
Right? There's
That's
always
a great point.
That meek person who you just like, that is the sweetest man, woman, whoever, right? It's so nice to work with so-and-so, right?
Yeah.
Or it's so amazing to, be around somebody who's so patient, so kind, so loving, right? So humble, all those things, right? Everyone knows somebody that we respect for that, in that case, right? On the flip side of that, you can't be the guy everyone walks on, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Well, and I think the Sermon on the Mount bears that out too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the same time, don't be afraid to be generous. Don't be afraid to be humble. Don't be afraid to be kind. Don't be afraid to be meek.
Yeah.
That's who we're meant to be, right? And it only, right, it's the water that raises all the boats, right? So
yeah.
this is important, right? So yeah.
Well, and that's I keep like, so the word, so in the next 3 weeks is the blessed are the Beatitudes, and that word, that every commentary I read, they pinpoint and highlight how important that word blessed is, which makes sense. Jesus uses it 11 times, so obviously he's trying to get something across. But they said you really have to understand that idea of the picture that Jesus is saying, that this is what the blessed life looks like. This is, and he says, they say that blessed, we've really convoluted our understanding of blessed. It's really the flourishing life or the happy life. Like this is what it means to live happily in the world, and that to do that is just such a different set of characteristics. But what's interesting is like there's this, you talked about the like kind of the rising tide lifts all boats. There's an understanding in the because they point to this idea of, or Jesus points to this idea of when you live this way, love your neighbor, love your enemy.
Then there's no enemy.
There's no enemy, and there's no one that can be an enemy, because you're not hating anybody, you're not othering somebody else.
And but it changes them too.
Well, and when you do that, the one of the ideas that gets pulled out is that when you live that way, and they would call it the kind of a virtue ethic or virtuous life. When you live that way, when you act virtuously in the world, it is inherently meaningful. Meaning, so when I act generously, humbly, or meekly, kindness, the fruit of the spirit, but also like honest, even courage would be a virtue. So like not letting people walk over you. So when you live that, it's when you act that way, it's inherently meaningful for you to do that. So just to act virtuously in the world, generously, whatever, is good for you. Like it's fulfilling. But it's equally, and this is what's so fascinating, I think, about virtues, because I've been looking into it a bunch, is when you live it, it's not only inherently meaningful for you, because we're all looking for meaning, it's also good for anybody else.
Yeah.
And so
it changes everyone around you.
Right. And so it really is this rising tide lifts all boats kind of things. When I act virtuously, it's good for everybody. And so that like it, and then when you look at, okay, well, so we have a way to live that Jesus tells us to, that's glorifying and honoring to God, that is inherently meaningful when we live that way, and is also beneficial to other people. So it's like Jesus has given us everything we need to live the kind of life that we would agree on is all meaningful. So I like, and I'm, it's easy to talk about, it's hard to do, but I wonder where we missed step. Because even I read the Sermon on the Mount, I'm like, yes, this is right, and then like I don't live it out either, like full, So where do we get it wrong? Like how do we, I don't know, where do we misstep?
I think it's very difficult to live the Beatitudes if that's the inverse of this world that we're in. It's difficult to try to live that way. It's not impossible. It's just difficult, right? And it requires self-discipline and sacrifice and a sense of humility that isn't common, right? None of us want to like humbling ourselves is very difficult.
Yeah.
There's that whole section in here where which is really hard for New Englanders, which is not mocking those around us. Right? There's that whole section where you say you fool, right? All that. That's like, it's just culturally difficult.
It's just there, yeah.
Right? Because we're just not in a place that makes that kind of life easy. But it's still what we're called to do, and we know by reading it, something in our hearts says this is right. So, wow, that's tough to try to make the bubble of your own world that way when you have to bump into all the thorny things and burst your bubble on a regular basis.
Yeah.
right?
You mean it's so you mean it's like even trying it as a challenge because of the world we live in just naturally.
Yeah, just it's. I think it's very difficult to be that. But we had an example
Yeah.
um, who was killed when he was 33.
Yeah.
But still, still there was an example. It's possible.
Do you, so on that, so I actually agree with you. I think that the best interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount is that in covenant with Jesus, that kind of through our relationship with him, he, because of him, because of the Spirit he's given us, he has divinely empowered us to live out the actual life of the Sermon on the Mount. Like it's hard but possible. So I totally agree with you. There is an interpretation, and this and I see this actually going away, but there is an interpretation where people would say, so Jesus says, and this is why I addressed the "be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect" last week, and I talked about, well, Jesus doesn't mean be sinless. He says be wholehearted, be devoted. But there is an interpretation that would say, well, Jesus is showing us that the life of, like you said, do not murder. Okay, I can do that, right? But Jesus says, it's not just about murder. Do not even say raka, or and Jesus is setting us up to fail and say, well, we can't live that out, which is why we need his righteousness. So it highlights the righteousness of Christ, but then it lowers it kind of also equally highlights our, fallen condition. And so we think, well, I'm good at not murdering, but
So far so good.
yeah, right. But yeah, so far, yeah. But I also, that hatred in my heart thing, well, I haven't figured that out, but I can't do it. So Jesus' righteousness covers that. How do you reconcile that with the it's hard but possible? Does that make sense, that question?
How do you reconcile that? Yeah.
Do you think they're reading it wrong? It's impossible, so I need to just lean on Christ's righteousness because I'm not going to get it, versus it's difficult but possible.
I think it's difficult, but a goal.
Oh,
Um,
that actually fits the interpretation really well. The goal, I've not thought of that.
because I think that if we were already able, we wouldn't need Jesus.
Yes, yeah. Let alone the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but we are not, and it's highlighted along the way. Right? These are the things you people do wrong all the time.
yeah,
And the guy gouge out your eye because, right, all that.
yeah.
Along the way, I mean, it's severe, right? It starts out kind of sweet, bless, the morning, the meek, right, and then gouge your eye out because, and be more righteous than the Pharisees, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, you aren't going to make this,
Yeah,
and it's understood, but you can make it a goal, right?
you aren't going to make it, but it doesn't remove your responsibility to move in that direction.
Correct.
Yeah.
These
I
are
like
the
that goal.
characteristics that you should reflect.
Yeah.
These are the ways this new world should live, right? Because that's what he's kicking off.
Yeah.
It's the Acts chapter 2 world, right? So that this is how we should be, and this is how we should support each other, and this is what a loving community looks like that supports each other and grows.
Yeah.
Things are going to happen. It's not going to be easy, right? Blessed are you when the world mocks you, right?
Yeah.
In my name.
Yeah.
All that, it's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, he does. Yeah, it's nice because he's not saying, "Hey, everything's going to be just peachy after you start doing this."
You're going to take it on the chin.
He's like,
and smile.
He's like,
because that's how it goes, right?
That's really good.
Because that's part of the gig,
Yeah.
right? That's what you're signing up for. It's not that it's like you said, peachy, right? It's not going to be super smooth. It's going to be hard.
Yeah.
And already just the idea of changing to be humble and kind and sweet and meek is hard.
Yeah.
Right there, just doing that.
Yes.
giving your shirt away because your friend asks for it, right? And then adding your coat, right?
Yeah.
Because they ask. I don't understand the forced mile walk. I don't understand how that goes. What was that part about? Does that happen a lot?
I think it culturally what it was.
Walk with me for a mile.
Well, a Roman
Hello?
soldier could demand
Oh, that you carry something.
that you carry something. Like Roman soldier could be walking around, look at you and demand that you carry something of his for. And I think there was a designated
Yeah.
time, and so like a mile or whatever the stadia or whatever stadia is money, I think. But anyway, whatever the distance was, and then Jesus is saying, "Go ahead and do that," but then keep going. Which again is like, it just smashes against my ego even to hear that. Like,
Right.
I don't want to let some guy walk all over me.
And that's that we lose.
Yes, right.
That piece of that piece of us that wants to win, right, and feels victorious by resisting, right. That's the part he addresses where he says, "The meek inherit the world." Right? Right?
Do you think so? On that, actually, I just this was so. The three beat the first three: meek, mourn, poor in spirit. One of the books I'm reading, and I really appreciate this idea, is he says it's not just like a precondition to receiving grace. That he said it is like you. In order to understand grace, you need to understand that you have need for grace, right? Like
Yeah.
So, but he said it's not like you just one time are meek or one time are in need of mercy for your mourning, or
Right.
one time you're poor in spirit. He's like actually it's the ongoing condition of where you recognize that you were just always in need of mercy. You're always in periods of mourning. It may not look like you're weeping and wailing, but there's always senses of like, I'm not lived up to this goal or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So he said it's an ongoing condition, not just a precondition. It's
Yes.
an ongoing. The first three. But then you said, you talked about the idea of winning. Like you recognize that we recognize through the Sermon on the Mount that we're not always gonna win. Like we're gonna take it on the chin. And so it's almost like. So, and this is kind of the do you think. I'm working this idea out in real, it's like building a plane in the air, because you made me think of something I hadn't thought about. Do you think that that the Sermon on the Mount always leads back to those first three? So you slaps you on one cheek, you offer him the other. You go 1 mile, you go with him 2. You love your enemy. It's always smashing against your ego. I said, but then you said life isn't. It really hits us where we want to win and we don't. Is it always leading us back to the beginning? I mean, not linearly, but I mean as a sense of like, it's always going to challenge those areas
It's
for
a
us to be poor in
foundational
spirit.
piece of it, right? And without that foundation, none of it stands or works. So without those conditions,
Yeah.
then the rest of it's, what are you doing? So
Huh.
I think, wow, because it's such a broad bunch of
It is.
ideas, right? But it's a set of ideas that start in a point and spread out.
Yeah. Oh.
And as they fan out and cover a variety of topics that are part of all our lives and will be part of all our lives until there are no humans, because
All the time. Right.
all
Yeah.
the time humans fail in these ways.
Yeah.
And he just kind of highlights them all, which is amazing. Like to just point out all human foibles in a list of things that I'm blessing you for.
Yeah, it is wild.
Right?
I mean, he deals like the lust, anger,
We are just full of flaws, right?
He's just not pulling punches.
Yeah.
So you're saying that I think all the Beatitudes, but like the first three, like they really are the core. There's a core sense of, there really is a beginning point. You have to begin with that in order for you to understand the rest of it.
That's the entry to, and boom, here's all the rest. These are all with these pieces.
Yeah.
You inherit, right? With these pieces, this is, these are the things that you're going to be blessed with. And I like the idea, the thing that's actually really fascinating in that first three, right? So, previous to this recording, we were discussing, human death rituals, which are just amazing and strange and fascinating, right? How we interact and deal with. But one of these things is, blessed are those who mourn because they'll be comforted. And that's the blessing, is the comforting. Because, we walk through supermarket, we walk by somebody on the sidewalk, we sit next to somebody on a bus or a train or whatever it is, in an office. We're not comforting those people. Who knows what everybody's going through. We're just, maybe make eye contact.
Yeah.
Or say hi. And, these people are suffering. They're mourning.
Yeah.
They have experienced incredible loss, right? So they're feeling this loss, and their blessing is the comfort of everyone else who's been reserving it until now.
Oh, yeah. Because there's a collective sense of offering it as as the church that we become in place to, we receive comfort from God, but the way that we often receive comfort from God, this is 2 Corinthians, is it's through his people.
It triggers a sensitivity that we reserve. And that's amazing.
Yeah.
And then the other one that kind of fascinates me on that list is, where'd you go? I think it's poor in spirit.
I thought you were going to say cheesemakers, but
also cheesemakers.
Yeah.
Because I'm looking at the NIV translation. So blessed are the poor in spirit, because for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Which that always fascinates me, because I'm never really sure exactly what the original wording was or meaning was for poor in spirit. They have bad spirits. They're insufficient spirits. They don't have enough spirit. What is meant by poor here?
Is it like quality or quantity? Is it?
Yeah. I would really like to understand that translation, so put it in the notes. But the next, verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So there's two groups who get kingdom of heaven. Persecuted because of righteousness and poor in spirit. Those two groups get kingdom of heaven. Which, whoa, that's significant.
Well, what if, and I don't know this, what if they're the same group? Meaning that I don't, if you're, righteous living is to live rightly before people, so to live rightly before God and other people. And the only way to do that is, the Sermon on the Mount maps it out for us, but really the only way to do that is to poor in spirit, and so on. So what if those who have poor in spirit, kingdom of heaven, are, as they live righteously, are going to be persecuted for the way that they live righteously? Because I think to be, we often like to equate persecution with standing up for our faith or defending our faith, or like we're holding some kind of front, which ends up usually being more about us than it is about righteousness. It's more about our preferences and our desires and what we want than it is about actually living right before God and others. To actually live right before others righteously in God, I think takes poor in spirit, because otherwise it just becomes ego, and I'm being persecuted for my beliefs when it's really not that at all. You're not being, it's because you have a preference that you're enacting that's not, that has nothing to do with the gospel. So I think to actually be persecuted for actual righteousness, I think takes poor in spirit. So I wonder if they're the same group. I don't know. Maybe not. I don't know, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I would really like to see the translation of that first verse, just that verse 3, just to understand what is meant. But it is interesting that they translate it to that. But that actually, the persecuted for righteousness, gets me thinking about the verse also that says, who among you, would be willing to die on behalf of your brothers, right? One, you might die for a righteous man.
Yeah.
But would you die for anybody?
Right. Yeah. And that's convicting.
Right? Gut punch. So, persecuted for righteousness. If the thing that's amazing is, in that sentence, he's highlighting our innate ability to judge that somebody is righteous, right? To say that somebody is righteous and think, oh, well, that guy was good. I'm going to die on his behalf. We do that. We make judgment calls about people all the time because that's how we function.
Because it makes us, yes. Yeah,
Right.
because it validates our, yeah.
Right? So
That's really good.
But then, so we understand what that means. If you're being persecuted for your righteousness, does someone ever come to defend you on that behalf? Or do you join with the rock throwing crowd and then get called on the way with blinding light? Who knows? It's weird and amazing. But I do love that about both of the Ten Commandments and this list. It's like the God looking down going, oh man, come on. I'm going to make this easy.
Yeah. Right. There's only 10 things. Yeah.
I gave you 10 toes and fingers. You can count that high. So look, this is all you got to do. This is how you live life. Or even this, again, like we said earlier, the wealthy ruler, the young ruler.
Yeah. There's only a couple things.
Only a couple things.
Yeah.
All you got to do is don't be a jerk, right? Just don't be nice.
Well, and the sermon. A lot of people would say the sermon. Well, actually, Jesus says it, and this will get covered. But Jesus came to fulfill the law,
the law and the prophets.
Right.
Don't discredit any of that.
Right, and so it's not like the sermon, the Ten Commandments or anything. The law is like, it's not negated. It's not gone. It's actually fulfilled in Jesus as
living
the
sacrifice.
And then through the Sermon on the Mount, it's like, well, this is what it actually looks like to live out. And so again, he's not like, it's tough. I'm not denying it's very difficult to live out, but it's not like it's a mystery. I think that's what it is.
That's true.
It's not like was I supposed to love my enemy? I'm not really sure. Was I like
there are no secrets.
Yeah,
it's all spelled out.
That's I think one of the,
we trip on it all the time.
That's the thing. I think the Sermon on the Mount has been good for me to read through. Is like he's really not giving us any surprises on it's just that we trip on it. That's a great way of thinking about it. That we I think we know there's no surprises, but we trip on it. So I'm glad that we've theoretically figured out all of the Sermon on the Mount. We'll come back and we'll do kind of piece by piece. This was kind of the beginning, kind of an intro, kind of a discussion on the whole part, but we'll come through and we'll hit some of the major headings as we go through.
An arterial oblation. Just whoa. Right? Because you hit that and you're just like,
oh, okay.
Man, look at that. These are the things that I've been blocking the arterial flow of my body, right? Of my spiritual body all this time with all this junk. And this is how blood flows correctly. Ooh. Well,
and there is a sense of and I'm growing in this personally, even as I read the Sermon on the Mount, but it's like, well, if we, God is mysterious. I'm not denying that God should be mysterious. There's no way we can comprehend the fullness of God. However, the things that God has called us to do, I really don't think are that mysterious. The way He's called us to live. I don't know what God's will is for my life. I do. Read Matthew 5-7 and do that for the rest of your life. It'll take an entire life to figure out.
Yeah, that's gonna be tough, but yeah.
But there's not really a mystery of how we're called to live. And again, that's not me having figured out and now I'm actually right in line of oh man, there really isn't a mystery on how I'm called to live. It's just I trip over it. It's such a good way of putting it. But it's helpful for me to think Jesus really gave us everything we need to live this life out. He's empowered us to do it, and He said, "Yeah, this is how you do it." But we trip over it. So we'll keep talking about and I think talking about and wrestling through what does this actually mean for us to live this stuff out. So that. I think covers us, maybe not through the Sermon on the Mount, but at least kind of lets us jump into the deep end.
Yeah, I mean it's just deep end to start with, but yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. There's no shallow end in the Sermon.
No.
Yeah. When something starts out, blessed are the poor in spirit, you're like, oh, we're in for a ride.
Well, yeah. He sat down at the top of the hill and went, "Hey, look at this crowd. Let's just dip our toe in it's warm. Go!" Yeah, that's it. Laps.
Go.
Oh man.
All right. Well, thank you, sir. It's good to
Thank you.
begin back, and we will see you next time.
See you next time with our funny hats.